They called me worthless. Said I was too loud, too stubborn, too much. Said I'd come crawling back broken, but I didn't. I signed enlistment papers on my 18th birthday, traded their silence for purpose, their judgment for boots that carried me into chaos. I've held lives in my hands, whispered hope while pressing wounds closed, carried children through smoke while bullets snapped past. And one day, the commander stood beside me and said, "You've saved more lives than any general I know." That day, they finally saw me. But I saw myself first. Have you ever been called worthless? By the people you needed love from the most. Hi, my name is Tessa Carter, and for most of my life my family saw me as nothing more than a mistake in boots. I wish I could tell you it was different. I wish I could tell you that growing up my mother would ruffle my hair and call me her brave little girl, or that my father would pat my back whenever I got a scraped knee telling me how proud he was. But that wasn't my story. My story started in a small, creaky house in Ohio with a mother who believed in two things: piano recitals and pageant smiles, and a father who measured worth by how perfectly you could sit still at Sunday service. My older brother Ethan was the golden child, the quarterback, the pride of every dinner conversation. His trophies lined the mantel, and his laughter was the soundtrack of our family dinners. And me, I was the background noise. I tried. I really did. I tried to like piano, but my fingers itched to hold something real like the old radio I'd taken apart in the garage to see how it worked. I tried to wear the pretty dresses my mother laid out for me, but I'd end up with grass stains on the knees racing the neighborhood boys to the end of the street. I remember one afternoon when I was 15. I was sitting on the porch steps reading a book about battlefield medicine I'd found at the library, highlighting the pages with words like hemorrhage control and tourniquet application. My mother came outside, her high heels clicking against the old wooden boards. "What are you reading, Tessa?" she asked, her eyes narrowing when she saw the cover. "Trauma response," I said softly. "It's about medics in combat and how they save lives under fire." She stared at me like I'd just told her I wanted to join the circus. "A medic," she scoffed, the word rolling off her tongue like it tasted foul. "What, you want to run around with soldiers patching up people who get themselves shot? That's not a real future, Tessa. That's not what girls like you should even think about. Girls like me." She always said that. Girls like me. The me that didn't belong in frilly dresses. The me that ran too fast, spoke too loud, dreamed too big. The me that was in her eyes worthless. That word. It clung to me, sticking to my skin like a bruise no one could see. It echoed in the quiet of my room, in the way my brother would smirk when I said I wanted to do something different, something brave. "Mom's right, Tess," Ethan would say, tossing a football from hand to hand. "Stop trying to act like you're someone you're not." But even then I knew something they didn't. I wasn't acting. I remember standing in front of the mirror on my 18th birthday, looking at the reflection of a girl in jeans and an old t-shirt, the reflection of a girl who knew she didn't belong in that house. Everyone else was downstairs waiting to cut the cake, but I was upstairs holding the pen that would sign my enlistment papers. On my 18th birthday, I didn't blow out candles. I signed papers. And in that moment, for the first time, I felt a spark of worth. A spark that said maybe, just maybe, I wasn't worthless. Maybe I could build a life that wasn't defined by the narrow hallways of that house, by the cold looks of my mother, or the quiet disappointment of my father. I didn't tell them that day. I left the papers on the kitchen counter next to the half-eaten birthday cake with "Happy Birthday, Tessa" scrawled in pink frosting. My mother's handwriting, neat and perfect like the image she wanted her family to be. When she saw the papers, she didn't cry. She didn't even yell. She just looked at me, her eyes cold, and said, "Don't expect us to wait around when you come crawling back." Ethan didn't say goodbye. My father didn't hug me. As I walked out of that house, the word worthless followed me, nipping at my heels, whispering in the back of my mind that I would fail, that I would come home broken, that I would regret every step I took away from that porch. But I didn't look back. Not once. Because deep down, under all the fear, under all the doubt they tried to plant in me, I knew that the only way to prove them wrong was to become the person I was meant to be. Even if it meant leaving behind the only family I had ever known. Even if it meant walking into the unknown alone. I didn't know then that one day the word worthless would lose all its power. I didn't know that one day the commander of an entire nation would look me in the eye and say, You saved more lives than any general I know. But I was about to find out. And this was just the beginning. On my 18th birthday, I didn't blow candles. I signed papers. They told me I would regret it. They told me I would come crawling back, that the world was too big, too harsh for a girl like me, that I would realize I wasn't cut out for it. That first morning at basic, standing in the cold dawn air with my duffel bag at my feet, I wondered if they were right. I looked around at the other recruits, some with tears still wet on their cheeks as they hugged their parents goodbye. Fathers clapping their sons on the back, mothers whispering prayers into their daughters' ears. Me, I had no one there. No last hug, no whispered, "Be safe." Just the echo of my mother's words before I closed the door behind me. Don't expect us to wait around. I stood straighter even as fear curled in my stomach like a clenched fist. Because if I was going to do this, I had to do it on my own. The first few weeks were a blur of barking drill sergeants, mud sweat, and the sting of cold mornings that burned the skin. My body ached in places I didn't know existed, my fingers cracked from scrubbing floors, my arms bruised from crawling under barbed wire. Every night, I would collapse into the thin cot staring at the ceiling, listening to the muffled sobs of girls who missed home, who missed mothers who would tell them it was okay, fathers who would tell them they were proud. And in the silence of those nights when the darkness felt too heavy, I would hear her voice in my head. Worthless. That word became my fuel. Every push-up, every sprint, every time I thought I would break, I would hear it, and I would push harder, run faster, hold on longer. If I quit, they would be right. If I failed, they would win. And I couldn't let that happen. It was during the 4th week of training that everything changed. We were in the middle of a field exercise simulating a live fire scenario. Smoke grenades choked the air, the sound of blanks cracking through the cold morning as we crawled through mud, dragging our rifles, our hearts pounding like war drums. That's when I heard a scream. It wasn't part of the exercise. It was sharp, panicked, cutting through the chaos like a blade. I turned and saw one of the guys, Rodriguez, clutching his leg, blood seeping through the fabric of his uniform. He'd tripped and fallen onto a piece of exposed rebar hidden in the mud, the metal tearing into his thigh. Everyone froze, eyes wide, unsure, looking around for someone to do something. I didn't think so. I dropped to my knees beside him, pressing my hands to the wound, feeling the warmth of blood seeping between my fingers. His eyes were wild with fear, tears streaking down his dirty cheeks. It hurts, oh God, Tessa, look at me. I said, my voice steady, even though inside I was shaking. You're going to be okay. I need you to breathe. I tore open the field dressing, wrapping it tight around his leg, pressing down hard, ignoring his screams. I remembered the diagrams I had highlighted in the library book. Remembered the steps: direct pressure, elevation, and reassurance. I didn't notice the drill sergeant standing over us until he knelt down, his hand clamping over mine to check the placement. He looked at me, his eyes unreadable. Good work, Carter. That night, Rodriguez was taken to the base clinic, and I stayed up sitting on the edge of my cot staring at my hands, still stained with blood. I couldn't scrub out completely. My hands. The same hands my mother once told me should be used to play piano, to sew, to serve. That night they had saved someone. And for the first time in that cold, drafty barracks, I felt something bloom in my chest. Worth. A few days later, Rodriguez found me in the mess hall, limping but smiling. He dropped his tray beside mine, wincing as he sat down. They said if you hadn't acted so fast, I could have bled out, he said, his voice quiet, almost embarrassed. Thanks, Tessa. You're a damn hero. I shook my head, feeling heat rise in my cheeks. I'm no hero, I said. But the truth was, for the first time, I wanted to believe maybe I could be. From that day on, the others started calling me Doc during field drills. It wasn't official, I wasn't a medic yet. But the name stuck. Doc, over here, Doc, can you check this out? And every time I heard it, a piece of that old word worthless crumbled away. Letters came to the barracks every Sunday. Girls around me would squeal when they saw handwriting they recognized, clutching the envelopes to their chests before reading them under their blankets. I wrote letters too. To my mother. To my father. To Ethan. I told them I was doing well, that I was learning, that I was working hard. Weeks passed. No letters came back. I told myself it was okay. that I didn't need their words, that I didn't need their pride. But some nights when the lights went out and I laid there listening to the soft breathing of the others, I would close my eyes and pretend I could hear them saying, "We're proud of you, Tessa." Even if it wasn't true. But that's the thing about silence. You can let it break you. Or you can let it shape you. And I decided right there that if my family wasn't going to give me something to fight for, then I would fight for something bigger. Because I wasn't worthless. And I was going to prove it. Little did I know this was just the beginning. I thought the basics were hard. I thought mud, sweat, and bruises were the worst it could get. I didn't know what was waiting for me on the other side of the ocean in a land I couldn't even pronounce. I didn't know how many lives I would hold in my hands, how many final breaths I would witness, how many prayers I would whisper for strangers under a sky lit with fire. And I didn't know that one day the commander himself would look at me in front of the world and say, "You saved more lives than any general I know." But before we get there, let me tell you about the day I truly became a medic. Because that day changed everything. You don't learn to save lives in calm, you learn it in screaming chaos. They say you don't become a medic in a classroom. You become a medic when your hands are shaking, your heart is pounding so loud you can't hear yourself think, and you have to decide in a single breath whether the person in front of you lives or dies. I learned that on the first day of combat medic school. After basic training, they sent me to Fort Sam Houston. The air smelled like heat and anticipation, sweat mixed with disinfectant as dozens of us lined up, young, stubborn, terrified, and ready to learn how to keep people alive when everything around us was trying to kill them. There was a sign above the door to the training bay that read, "The mission of a medic is to preserve the fighting strength." But, standing there clutching my clipboard, I felt the words settle into my bones, "To preserve life. Any life I could." The first week they broke us down with numbers and anatomy quizzes that made your head spin, drills that made your knees ache. We spent hours learning how to identify shock, how to treat burns, how to stop bleeding with makeshift tourniquets. We practiced on dummies, the rubber skin slick under our fingers, the fake blood sticky and sweet-smelling. It was nothing like the real thing. One morning our instructor, Sergeant Collins, a wiry man with eyes like flint, tossed a bloodied vest at me. "You think you know pressure dressing, Carter? Prove it." He dragged out a weighted dummy, this one programmed to bleed when hit. I dropped to my knees, trying to remember the steps, wrapping the gauze, tying it tight, my fingers slipping. A red puddle spread beneath the dummy, soaking into the mat. "He's dead," Collins snapped. "Try again." I felt heat rise in my face, tears pricking at the corners of my eyes. Worthless. That word crept back in, slithering through the cracks, whispering that maybe my mother was right, that maybe I wasn't cut out for this, that maybe this was too much. But I clenched my jaw, wiped my face with my sleeve, and tried again, and again, and again, until the red puddle stopped growing. Until I looked up, and Collins was nodding. "That's what it takes," he said, his voice softer just for a moment. "Out there, it's not about being perfect, it's about not giving up." They started running us through combat simulations after that. Rooms filled with flashing lights, speakers blaring gunfire and screams, the smell of smoke and burning rubber pumped into the air. They would drag us in blindfolded, rip the cloth away, and scream, "Go!" There would be bodies everywhere, dummies with missing limbs, fake blood spraying, recordings of men crying out for help. Your job was to think, to move, to assess. Who do you help first? Who can wait? Who won't make it? No one tells you how much it breaks you the first time you have to step over someone to get to someone else, because you know even in a simulation that this is what it will be like for real. One day they added live actors, other soldiers screaming in your face, shaking, clutching at you while you tried to work. A young man grabbed my arm, tears streaming down his face, fake blood bubbling from a chest wound. "Please, doc, please don't let me die." My hands trembled as I applied the seal to his chest, pressing down, trying to block out the sounds around me. His pulse on the monitor started to stabilize. His eyes met mine, and even though it was training, even though it wasn't real, he whispered, "Thank you, Doc." That night, I sat on my bunk, looking at my hands. Hands that once struggled to play piano, hands my mother said should learn to fold laundry properly, hands that weren't ladylike enough. Hands that had just saved a life even in simulation. Hands that were becoming the tools I would use to prove to the world and to myself that I was not worthless. The hardest lesson came in the form of a quiet conversation with Sergeant Collins after a simulation. I had missed a tourniquet application on a casualty, and Collins pulled me aside. "You know what the hardest part about being a medic is, Carter?" I shook my head, swallowing the lump in my throat. "It's not the blood. It's not the screams. It's knowing you can't save everyone." I looked down, tears welling up despite my best efforts. "But you try anyway," he added softer. "That's what makes you a medic." As weeks turned into months, I found my rhythm. My scores went up, my hands steadied, my mind cleared under pressure. When chaos erupted in the training bay, I was the one barking orders, moving from casualty to casualty, controlling the scene. "Doc Carter," they started calling me. And every time I heard it, I felt a piece of that old word, worthless, fall away, replaced by something stronger, something I didn't even recognize at first. Pride. Graduation day at Combat Medic School was quiet. No one from home came. No mother with tears of pride. No father with a firm handshake. No brother to slap me on the back. I stood in my pressed uniform, boots polished to a shine, as Collins pinned the badge to my chest. "You're ready, Doc," he said. "Just remember, out there, you'll be the difference between life and death. Don't ever forget that." I nodded, my heart pounding, the weight of that truth settling on my shoulders. That night, I sat alone on my bunk, tracing the badge with my fingers, the metal cool against my skin. I thought about the girl who had left home with nothing but a duffel bag and the word worthless ringing in her ears. I thought about the woman I was becoming, the medic I was now. And I promised myself that no matter where I was sent, no matter what I faced, I would not let that word define me ever again. Because now I had a mission. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I was exactly where I was meant to be. But even then, I didn't know what awaited me next. I didn't know what it would feel like to crawl through the dirt, bullets screaming overhead with a soldier's lifeblood pumping between my fingers. I didn't know what it would mean to watch someone take their last breath and feel their hand slip from mine. I didn't know that one day everything I had trained for would lead to a moment that would change my life forever. And it all started the day I landed in Afghanistan. The first time you hear real gunfire, the world changes forever. You think you're ready. After months of drills, simulations, endless hours practicing how to tie a tourniquet in the dark or manage an airway while someone screams in your ear, you think you know what war will feel like. You don't. Not until you step off the transport plane into a dry, searing wind that smells like dust and diesel. Not until you hear that first crack of gunfire in the distance, so sharp it makes your heart stutter, your instincts screaming to duck even when no one else does. I was 24 when I first landed in Afghanistan. The sun was brutal, baking the ground until the heat rose in shimmering waves, and the mountains in the distance looked like silent sentinels watching every step we took. I remember gripping the strap of my aid bag so tightly my knuckles turned white, reminding myself to breathe, to stay calm, to be ready. Because that was my job now. Not to fight, not to shoot, but to save. They assigned me to a forward operating base with a small unit that ran convoy escorts and local patrols. I was the only medic on most missions, the weight of that responsibility heavier than any rucksack I'd ever carried. The first few patrols passed quietly. I checked vitals, patched blisters, treated dehydration, and handed out ibuprofen like candy. The soldiers would grin and call me Doc, fist bumping me as they loaded up. Sometimes I caught myself thinking, maybe it won't be as bad as everyone says. Maybe, just maybe, we'll be lucky. That illusion ended one morning just after dawn. We were rolling out in a convoy, the trucks kicking up clouds of dust that clung to our skin and coated our tongues with grit. I was in the second vehicle, wedged between my gear and a radio operator who hummed nervously under his breath. Then it happened. The world exploded. A deafening boom shook the truck, lifting us off the ground, before slamming us back down. My head snapped against the window, stars bursting in my vision as I tasted blood in my mouth. Someone was screaming. The engine roared, then died. Smoke filled the cab, acrid and choking, and for a moment all I could hear was the ringing in my ears and the thunder of my heartbeat. "Move, Tessa. Move." I pushed the door open, stumbling out onto the road, my boots crunching over debris and shattered glass. The first vehicle was on its side, black smoke curling into the sky. Flames licked at the undercarriage. Then I heard it. A voice hoarse and terrified calling out, "Doc, we need a medic." I didn't think so. I ran. Bullets started snapping through the air, popping like angry bees, sending up little puffs of dirt around my feet. Someone shouted for me to get down, but I kept moving, weaving between the vehicles, my aid bag slamming against my hip. Behind the overturned truck, I found them. 3 soldiers, 2 trying to drag the third out of the wreckage. He was young, his face pale beneath the grime, blood soaking his pant leg where it was twisted at an unnatural angle. His eyes met mine, wide and terrified. "Doc, please." I dropped to my knees, ignoring the gravel biting into my skin. I ripped open my bag, pulling out gauze, a tourniquet, my hands moving on instinct even as the world around me felt like it was moving in slow motion. "What's your name?" I shouted over the gunfire. "Alvarez," he gasped. "Okay, Alvarez, look at me," I said, wrapping the tourniquet around his thigh, tightening it until he screamed. "You're going to be okay. Breathe with me. In, out." The gunfire felt distant as I worked assessing him, checking for other wounds, reassuring him while my hands moved automatically. He gripped my wrist, his blood-slick fingers trembling. "Don't tell my mom I was scared," he whispered, tears mixing with the dirt on his cheeks. "You're not scared, Alvarez," I lied, forcing a smile. "You're the bravest kid I've ever seen." I held his hand until the medevac arrived, the helicopter's blades whipping the dust into a storm as they loaded him up, his eyes still locked on mine as they lifted him away. When the bird took off, I sat back on my heels, the adrenaline draining from my body so fast I thought I might pass out. Around me, the world slowly came back into focus, the shouts of the soldiers, the hiss of the flames, the crackle of radios calling in reports. My hands were covered in blood, shaking as I tried to wipe them on my pants, the red smearing into the fabric. And then I felt it. The tears. They burned hot as they rolled down my face, mixing with the dust and sweat dripping onto my blood-stained hands. I let them fall just for a moment. Then I stood up, because there were others who needed me. That night, back at the base, I sat alone, replaying every second in my mind. The look in Alvarez's eyes. The sound of his voice asking me not to tell his mother he was scared. The weight of his life in my hands. I didn't write home about that day. What would I say? That I crawled through the dirt while bullets flew past, pressing my hands into a stranger's wound, whispering lies to keep him calm while I fought to keep him alive. That I was scared, that I was a live number. I didn't write home because I knew they wouldn't understand. To them I was still just Tessa, still the girl who ran too fast, who didn't know her place, who was worthless. But in that moment out there in the dirt with the weight of someone's life in my hands, I knew something else. I was not worthless. I was needed. And that was just the beginning. I didn't know that the next mission would change everything. That the next life I would hold in my arms wouldn't be a soldier but a child. That I would have to make a choice that would haunt me forever. Sometimes you run into fire because you know you can't live with yourself if you don't. War has a rhythm. People think it's all screaming and chaos, but there's a quiet too, the kind that settles over you right before everything shatters. It was early morning when we got the call. A civilian convoy had taken a wrong turn outside Fallujah, right into the middle of an ambush zone. By the time we arrived, the world was smoke and screams, fire licking at twisted metal, the acrid scent of burning fuel stinging our eyes. Bullets cracked overhead as we took cover behind a crumbling wall, scanning the chaos for any signs of survivors. My sergeant's voice crackled through the comms. "Carter, hold position until the area secured." But as I crouched there, clutching my aid bag to my chest, I saw her. A small girl, maybe 8 years old, her hair matted with ash, clutching something wrapped in a dirty cloth to her chest as she crawled out from under the wreckage of a flipped car. She was crying, but the sound was swallowed by the chaos around us. She stumbled, falling to her knees, the cloth slipping to reveal the tiny limp arm of a baby no older than a few months, the child's face pale, unmoving. And in that moment, everything else disappeared. I heard the sergeant's voice in my ear, sharp, commanding, "Negative, Carter. Do not break cover. We don't know what's out there." My heart was pounding so hard it drowned out the rest of the words. I looked at the girl, the way her small shoulders shook as she tried to protect the baby, the way she looked around with wide, terrified eyes. And I knew. I couldn't stay. I ripped off my pack and bolted from behind the wall. Bullets snapped past, slamming into the dirt around my boots, sending up clouds of dust that stung my eyes. Someone shouted after me, but the sound was lost in the roar of gunfire. All I could see was her. She tried to crawl away when she saw me coming, shielding the baby with her tiny body. "It's okay," I gasped, dropping to my knees beside her. "You're okay, you're safe now." She didn't understand the words, but she looked into my eyes, and for a moment the fear in her softened. I checked the baby, my hands trembling as I felt for a pulse. It was there. Faint, but there. The girl was bleeding from a gash on her leg, her breathing ragged from smoke inhalation. I worked fast, wrapping a bandage around her leg, lifting the baby into my arms, holding the small, warm weight against my chest. The girl reached up her fingers, clutching my sleeve, refusing to let go. I looked back toward the wall where my unit was still pinned down, their faces pale as they watched me out in the open. I knew what they were thinking. That I was reckless. That I was disobeying orders. That I was going to get myself killed. But as I lifted the girl into my arms, cradling her against my side while I held the baby to my chest, I knew one thing: I couldn't live with myself if I left them there. The walk back felt like miles, each step heavy as bullets kicked up dirt at my heels. I kept my head down, whispering to the girl, to the baby, to myself. "Stay with me, just a little longer." We made it to the wall, 2 Marines reaching out to pull us behind cover, their hands trembling as they took the baby from me. I collapsed to my knees, gasping for breath, sweat and smoke and tears mixing on my face as I checked the baby again, feeling the pulse stronger now. The girl was crying, clutching my hand so tightly it hurt, her eyes locked on mine, silently begging me not to leave her. "You're safe now," I whispered. The medevac arrived minutes later, the helicopter's blades whipping the smoke into a storm as they lowered the stretcher. As they lifted the baby, the girl started screaming, trying to reach for her sibling, but her strength gave out and she fell against me, sobbing into my chest. I held her, rocking, her gently whispering words she couldn't understand, but I hoped she could feel. "I've got you. I've got you." When they took her, she clung to my hand until the last second, her tear-streaked face turning back to look at me as they lifted her into the helicopter. And in that look I saw something I hadn't felt in a long time. Trust. As the bird lifted off, I sank back against the wall, my body shaking with adrenaline, exhaustion, and something else I couldn't name. A Marine dropped down beside me, his helmet askew, eyes wide. "Doc," he said, "you're insane." I let out a shaky laugh, wiping the smoke from my face. "Maybe," I said, "but they're alive." That night, as we returned to base, the weight of what I'd done started to sink in. I had disobeyed a direct order. I had risked my life and the mission to save 2 children I didn't even know. And yet, as I stripped off my blood-stained uniform, scrubbing the dirt and sweat from my skin, I didn't feel regret. I felt whole. Later, as I lay on my bunk staring at the ceiling, I thought about my mother's words. Worthless. But that word felt distant now, like a ghost that no longer had power over me. Because today, I had done something that mattered. Today, I saved lives. I didn't know then that those moments would follow me forever. That the little girl's eyes would haunt my dreams. That the choice I made in that burning street would ripple through my life, reaching all the way to a moment I could never have imagined. A moment when the commander himself would look at me and see me. But that is a story for another day. Because first I needed to face the consequences of what I had done. And I needed to decide whether I would let fear and rules define me, or if I would let the person I was meant to rise, no matter the cost. Coming home isn't always a welcome. They called it coming home. But the truth was, every time the convoy rolled back through the gates, part of you stayed out there, scattered on those dusty roads where you left your sweat, your fear, your blood. And sometimes the part you left was the part that could still sleep at night. I came back from that mission with 2 children's blood on my uniform and a reprimand waiting on my record. When we returned to base, they pulled me into the CO's office, the door closing behind me with a final click that made my stomach tighten. Captain Reynolds sat behind his desk, a man whose eyes had seen too much, but who hid it behind the strictness of command. He didn't shout. That almost made it worse. "Sit down, Carter." I sat back straight, trying to keep my hands from shaking. He flipped open a folder, reading the report I knew by heart. "You disobeyed a direct order." I swallowed hard. "Yes, sir." He looked up, his eyes pinning me in place. "You jeopardize your safety, your team's safety, and the mission." You put yourself in the open during an active firefight for two civilians we had no intel on. I wanted to speak, but I didn't. Because I had nothing to defend myself with that would change the facts. Finally, he closed the folder, leaning back in his chair. Why, Carter, my voice came out low, but steady. Because I couldn't live with leaving them there, sir. He rubbed a hand over his face, exhaling the weight of command heavy on his shoulders. You're a good medic, Carter, one of the best I've seen. But this, you can't let your heart overrule your orders. It'll get you killed. It'll get others killed. A pause. You're not a hero, Carter, you're lucky. And we can't build protocols around luck. They gave me a formal warning, not a demotion. But it felt like a scar I would carry forever. A reminder that even when you do the right thing, the world doesn't always see it that way. That night, I went back to my bunk, the reprimand paper crumpled in my hand, my uniform still carrying the faint stains of soot and blood I couldn't fully wash out. I laid on my back, staring at the ceiling, the whir of the fan mixing with the faint sounds of the bass outside. I thought about the little girl's eyes, the way she clung to my hand, the soft weight of her baby brother in my arms. And for a moment, I let myself feel it pride. Because they were alive. And I was the reason. I didn't write home about any of it. What would I say? That I had risked my life for strangers while my family didn't even know where I was. That I had been called reckless for choosing humanity over orders. That I was tired, bone-deep tired, but every morning I still laced up my boots, because someone out there might need me number. There was no point. The last time I wrote telling them about my graduation from combat medic school, I got no reply. The silence from home had become its own kind of answer. Then the day came when I rotated back stateside for leave. Home, they called it. But the moment I stepped off the plane, the weight of that word felt wrong. Thanksgiving. Ohio's cold had a bite that crept into your bones, a cold that felt sharper after the desert heat. I parked down the street from the house I grew up in, staring at the porch light, flickering like it had when I was a kid, the same crack in the driveway I used to race my bike over. I didn't even know why I was there. Maybe a part of me hoped that after everything I had done, everything I had survived, they would see me differently. Maybe my mother would open the door and see her daughter, not the disappointment she used to sigh at. Maybe my father would clap my shoulder, call me kiddo like he used to before he started looking past me. Maybe Ethan would look me in the eyes without that smirk. I knocked even though it was my house too once. The door opened and there she was, my mother, Margaret Carter, hair pulled back, apron on, the smell of cinnamon and turkey seeping out into the cold air. She looked at my uniform, her eyes flicking over the patches, the stripes, the medic symbol. Oh, she said, her lips pressing into a thin line. You're early, no hug, no welcome home, just that. Inside it was warm, too warm, the heat turned up to fight the Ohio winter, the windows fogging with steam. Ethan was there, laughing, a drink in hand, wearing a sweater that probably cost more than my entire deployment gear. He glanced at me, nodded. Hey, I'm still playing Army girl, huh? The words stung more than I wanted to admit. Dinner was a quiet affair, the clink of silverware louder than the conversations. They talked about Ethan's promotion, his new condo, my mother's new Pilates instructor, my father's golf games. I tried to tell them about the girl in Fallujah. About how I had carried her through smoke and bullets, how she had clung to me, how she had lived. But my mother coughed, dabbing her lips with a napkin. Let's not talk about bombs at the dinner table, Tessa. It's Thanksgiving. I fell silent, pushing the cranberry sauce around my plate, my mind thousands of miles away on a dusty road under a burning sky with a child's hand clutching mine. That night, I stepped out into the cold backyard, the stars hidden by clouds, my breath fogging in the darkness. I looked back at the house, the warm light spilling from the windows, laughter floating out, and I felt it. Alone. Because no matter how many lives I saved, no matter how many people called me doc, no matter how many commendations I had pinned to my uniform, in that house I was still the girl who didn't fit. The girl who was too loud, too stubborn, too much. The girl who was worthless. But as I stood there, the cold biting at my skin, I realized something. They didn't get to decide that anymore. I didn't come back for their approval. I came back because I had earned the right to walk into that house, to sit at that table, to be seen. Even if they couldn't see me. And so I left the next morning before sunrise, my boots echoing on the old wooden floors, my bag slung over my shoulder, my uniform pressed sharp. I didn't look back, because I didn't need to. What I didn't know then was that the next time I returned I wouldn't be alone in demanding they see me, because the commander himself would stand beside me, and they would have no choice but to finally see who I had become. Have you ever felt unseen in a room full of people who share your blood? They call it reintegration. That's what the counselors at the base told us. They said coming back stateside would feel strange, like the world was moving too fast, like you didn't quite fit anymore. What they didn't say was how empty the quiet would feel after you've spent months listening to the crackle of radios, the thump of helicopters, the hushed prayers of soldiers trying not to die in your arms. I returned to base after leave, the gates clanging shut behind me like a sigh of relief. Back to the world where people called me Doc with respect in their voices. Back to where no one cared if I was too loud, too stubborn, too much. Because here too much could save lives. The barracks smelled like old coffee and sand carried in on boots that had walked through places most people only saw on the news. I dropped my bag on my bunk, exhaling as the tension I didn't even realize I was carrying left my shoulders. A knock on the door. Doc Carter. A young private stood there, shifting nervously, clutching a piece of paper in his hand. They need you in the training bay. It was a new batch of medics. Kids barely out of high school, their eyes too bright, their smiles too quick, uniforms still stiff with newness. They lined up in front of me, trying to hide their nerves. I saw myself in them. The girl who had signed papers on her 18th birthday. The girl who left behind the word worthless on the porch steps of a house that never felt like home. Welcome, I said, my voice steady. You're here to learn how to save lives in the worst moments imaginable. They shifted, glancing at each other. I paused, letting the silence fill the space before continuing. You will get dirty. You will get tired. You will be scared, but you will move anyway because someone's life will depend on it. Their eyes widened, some swallowing hard, realizing this was real. Not a movie. Not a story. Real. We moved to the simulation room, the air filled with the scent of latex and antiseptic. The mannequins laid out with fake wounds, their blank eyes staring at the ceiling. I watched as they fumbled with tourniquets, their hands shaking, sweat beading on their foreheads as alarms blared, simulating the chaos of combat. One young man, Harris, dropped his gauze, cursing under his breath. His hands were trembling so badly he couldn't get the bandage to stay. Breathe, I said, kneeling beside him. His eyes met mine, wide with fear. What if I mess up, Doc? What if I can't do it when it's real? I took his hands in mine, steadying them. You will. Because when the moment comes, you won't think about being scared. You'll think about the person in front of you, and you'll move. Later, after the session, Harris found me in the hallway. Doc, how do you do it? How do you deal with everything? I paused, looking down at my hands. Hands that had held arteries closed while bullets flew overhead. Hands that had felt life slip away. Hands that had pulled a child from fire. You don't deal with it, I said quietly. You learn to live with it. And you keep going, because if you don't, who will? He nodded, the weight of that truth settling into his shoulders. That night, I sat alone in my room, the glow of the small desk lamp casting shadows on the walls. I picked up my phone, scrolling through the old text threads with my mother, the last message from me still unread. Made it back safe. Nothing. I stared at the screen, the emptiness of it pressing into my chest. Then, I set the phone down. Because I realized something. I didn't need a reply to know I mattered. They may never understand what I've seen, what I've done, why I chose this path. They may never see the woman I've become. But the soldiers who call me Doc do. The ones who walk into danger knowing I'll be there if they fall. The children who cling to my hand, trusting me to carry them out of the fire. They see me. The next morning I woke before dawn, lacing up my boots as the base came alive around me. A call came in, they needed a medic on a convoy heading out. I grabbed my bag, tightening the straps, feeling the familiar weight settle on my shoulders. As I stepped out into the cool morning air, I paused, looking up at the fading stars. I'm not worthless. I whispered it, not to the sky, not to anyone else, but to myself. And for the first time, I believed it. What I didn't know was that soon the world would see it too. That the commander himself would say it out loud. That in a room full of people who once refused to see me, the truth would be spoken. But before that moment came, I had more work to do. More lives to save. More pieces of myself to discover. Because the girl who once left home searching for worth had found something even greater. Purpose. I wasn't invited to be seen. I was invited to be silent. The invitation came in a plain white envelope tucked into the stack of deployment papers and medical supply requests on my desk. It was from my mother. Ethan is getting married. We expect you to attend. No, please. No, we would love to see you. Just we expect. I stared at the card for a long time, the gold script, spelling out the date and location, the smiling engagement photo of Ethan and his fiancée, both glowing with the promise of a perfect life. My fingers tightened around the edges of the card. It had been months since I last heard from them. No calls, no messages. No, are you safe during my deployments? But for Ethan's big day, they suddenly remembered I existed. I could have said no. I could have crumpled the card and tossed it in the trash, gone back to preparing medkits and training new recruits. But something inside me whispered, go. Not for them, but for me. When I landed in Ohio, the cold air was like a slap, sharp and biting, reminding me that I was home and yet not home. I rented a car and drove past the streets. I once knew the coffee shops I had sat in alone, the sidewalks I had run on, trying to escape the weight of being too much. The wedding was at a vineyard outside town, the kind of place with white pillars and fairy lights strung across oak trees, where people sipped champagne and pretended life was perfect. I arrived early, pulling into the gravel lot, shutting off the engine, letting the silence settle around me. I glanced at the uniform laid out on the passenger seat, the dress blues, pressed sharp metals glinting softly in the pale winter light. Before I left base, I hesitated. Should I wear it? My mother's words echoed in my mind. Don't pull focus from your brother. But this wasn't about focus, it was about truth. I had earned every stripe, every medal, every scar beneath that fabric. And for once I would not hide who I was. When I stepped out, the valet froze, eyes flicking to the ribbons on my chest, then back to my face. Thank you for your service, he stammered. I nodded, adjusting my cover, the cold wind tugging at the edges of my uniform as I walked toward the entrance. Inside, warmth and laughter spilled across polished floors, guests clinking glasses, soft music playing. Heads turned as I walked in. Some eyes widened, others looked away quickly. I caught sight of Ethan across the room, dressed in a tailored suit, his smile wide as he shook hands, accepted congratulations. When he saw me, his smile faltered for just a moment before he turned away. My mother appeared, her hair pinned perfectly, pearls at her neck, a champagne flute in her hand. Her eyes swept over me, pausing at the uniform. Oh, she said softly. You wore that. I held her gaze. I didn't see a dress code that excluded national service. I replied, my voice calm. She flinched just slightly before forcing a smile. Well, just don't make today about you, Tessa. It's Ethan's day. I moved through the room, ignoring the stares, the whispers. I wasn't here to cause a scene. I wasn't here to prove anything to them. I was here because I had earned the right to be. The ceremony was held outside under a wooden arch draped with white roses. The winter air crisped the sky a pale blue. Guests settled into rows of chairs, murmuring softly, the scent of cold earth and wine on the breeze. I took a seat in the second row next to a place card that simply read T. Carter. Not daughter, not sister. Just an initial. As Ethan walked down the aisle, his eyes flickered to me, a shadow of discomfort crossing his face before he smiled for the cameras. I sat still, hands folded in my lap, the medals on my chest, catching the light, a silent testament to every moment I had lived when they thought I was wasting my life. During the vows, I watched the way my mother dabbed her eyes with a tissue, my father's hand resting on her shoulder, their smiles wide as they looked at Ethan. And, for a moment, the old ache returned. The ache of wanting to be seen, to be enough. But then I remembered the battlefield. The dust. The screams. The child's hand is mine. The soldiers who looked at me and saw not a disappointment but a lifeline. I wasn't here for them. I was here because I refused to disappear. After the ceremony, the reception began, glasses clinking, laughter rising into the air as the sun dipped below the vineyard hills. I stood off to the side watching content in my quiet. That's when the room fell silent. The double doors opened and a small security detail entered, scanning the room. Then he walked in. The commander. He was taller than I expected, his presence commanding, without trying, his eyes sweeping the room before they landed on me. He smiled and walked straight toward me. Gasps rippled through the crowd heads, turning eyes wide as the commander of the United States stopped in front of the girl they once called worthless. He extended his hand. "Sergeant Tessa Carter," he said, his voice warm, strong. "It's an honor to finally meet you." My breath caught. I took his hand, feeling the firmness of his grip, the reality of this moment. "Sir," I managed. He didn't let go immediately. Instead, he turned to the room, his voice rising above the stunned silence. "This woman," he said, "has saved more lives than any general I know." The words echoed, bouncing off crystal glasses and marble floors, settling into every corner of that perfect room. I saw my mother's hand fly to her mouth. My father's eyes dropped to the floor. Ethan's face was drained of color. And I stood there, not shrinking, not hiding, but standing in the truth of who I had become. Because for the first time they saw me. And I saw myself. But this was only the beginning. Because the moment the commander said those words, everything changed. Family called me worthless, until the commander stood beside me. The room was still vibrating with the commander's words. "This woman has saved more lives than any general I know." For a moment, the world felt frozen. Crystal glasses, halfway to lips, of fork paused over a plate, laughter replaced with stunned silence. I felt the weight of every deployment. Every night I lay awake in a dusty tent, listening for mortar rounds, every life I tried to save, while the world burned around me, settling into that silence. And I let it. Because this wasn't about proving something anymore. It was about being something. The commander turned back to me, giving a small nod before stepping aside to greet other guests, but the ripple he left in his wake was impossible to ignore. My mother's hand trembled as she set her glass down, her eyes, red lips parting as if to say something, anything. But nothing came. Ethan stood with his bright eyes darting between me and our mother, a muscle in his jaw tightening, like he wanted to speak but didn't know how. My father just stared down at the floor, his hands twisting around the stem of his glass. It would have been so easy to feel vindicated. To let pride bloom like a bright, bitter flower in my chest. To look at them and say, "See," but I didn't, because I wasn't here for that. I was here to stand in the truth of who I had become, whether they saw it or not. A voice called out over the music. "Family photos, everyone. Let's gather for the formal shoot." Chairs scraped as people stood, the hum of conversation, cautiously returning as the photographer gestured for people to move toward the center of the reception hall where the floral arch stood. Couples lined up, parents, smoothed hair, bridesmaids, adjusted dresses. I stood off to the side, fully prepared to step out of the frame. I was used to that. The one on the edges. The one behind the camera, not in front of it. I adjusted the medals on my uniform, turning slightly to leave when the photographer's voice rang out. "Excuse me, Miss Sargent, we need you in the center, please." I blinked. "Oh, I'm fine here," I replied quickly, stepping back. But the photographer insisted, waving me forward. "Please." Right in the middle. I hesitated, eyes scanning the crowd. That's when I saw the commander still nearby, watching the scene unfold. He caught my gaze, his eyes warm, steady. He nodded once, the smallest, most powerful gesture I had ever received. And at that moment, I understood. I stepped forward. Through the clusters of aunts and cousins who shifted to let me pass, through the silence that followed the clinking of heels on marble, through the uncertainty in the eyes of the people who once called me too much. I walked to the center, turning to face the camera, standing straight, shoulders back, medals catching the light. My mother moved to the side, her hand resting lightly on my father's arm as they watched, wordless. Ethan's eyes met mine, confusion, and something softer, something like respect flickering before he looked away. The photographer adjusted his lens, lifted it to his eye and paused. "Beautiful," he murmured, more to himself than to us. The commander stepped forward, standing beside me, close enough that our shoulders nearly touched. "That's where your family's true hero belongs," he said softly but loud enough for those around us to hear. And for the first time in my life, as the flash went off, I didn't feel like I was taking up space I wasn't meant for. I didn't feel like I was ruining the photo. I didn't feel worthless. I felt seen. The camera clicked again. Once, twice. And with each flash, I felt something heavy lifting from my chest. The weight of years spent trying to earn their approval. The ache of wanting to be enough. The fear of never being seen. I looked straight ahead, letting the light reflect off the metals that told my story when words had failed. I thought of Alvarez, the young soldier who had held my hand while I pressed down on his wound, whispering, "Tell my mom I wasn't scared." I thought of the little girl in Fallujah clutching my sleeve as I carried her through smoke and gunfire. I thought of every soldier who had called me Doc, with relief in their voice, trust in their eyes. They had seen me, even when my family didn't. After the photos, people began to drift back toward the dance floor, the music swelling as laughter cautiously returned. I moved to the edge of the room, needing a moment to breathe. That's when my mother approached me. She looked smaller somehow, her eyes uncertain, hands wringing the clutch in front of her. "Tessa," she began, her voice shaking. I didn't know." I looked at her, the woman who once called me worthless, who once told me to be quiet, to be smaller, to fit into a life that never felt like mine. I didn't say anything, because what was there to say? She reached out her hand, trembling, brushing lightly against mine. "Thank you," she whispered, eyes glistening. And I nodded. Not for her, but for me. Because in that moment, I realized I didn't need her to see me to know I was worth seeing. The commander left shortly after, but the echo of his words stayed. "You saved more lives than any general I know." I stood a little taller that day. Not because the commander had said it, but because I finally believed it. And that was the moment I stopped trying to fit into the picture they created for me, and started living in the truth of who I was meant to be. Sometimes healing begins in the silence that follows the truth. After the wedding, after the flash of the cameras and the commander's words that echoed through a room full of people who once looked past me, I returned to base. I thought maybe I would feel different. Maybe the ache I carried would disappear. Maybe the part of me that still longed for my mother's approval would finally go quiet. It didn't, not entirely. But something inside me shifted. And for the first time, the silence from my family no longer hurt the same way. Because I had stopped waiting for them to see me. At Walter Reed, the mornings came early, the halls filled with the hum of coffee machines and the low voices of soldiers learning how to carry the weight of what they had seen, what they had done. I walked those halls in my uniform boots, echoing on polished floors, moving from training rooms to clinics, answering questions from young medics with fear in their eyes. They called me Doc with respect, but now there was something else in the way they looked at me. Recognition. One morning, I walked into the trauma bay to find a group of new recruits clustered around a training dummy, their hands fumbling with gauze and clamps as they tried to remember the steps of controlling hemorrhage under pressure. One young man, Ramirez, was sweating, his hands shaking as he tried to apply a tourniquet. He looked up, eyes wide, panic rising. "Doc, I can't. What if I mess up? What if I can't do it fast enough when it's real?" I knelt beside him, my hand steady as I guided his trembling fingers. "Ramirez, look at me." His eyes met mine. "You will. You will, because someone will need you, and in that moment you will move even if you're scared." He swallowed, nodding, trying again this time, securing the tourniquet tight and clean. Afterward, as the recruits packed up, Ramirez lingered, clutching his helmet to his chest. "Doc, I saw the video," he said quietly. I blinked. "What video?" "Of the commander at the wedding. What he said about you." My breath caught just for a moment. The video had made its way around the base through group chats and quiet whispers. "That's why I joined," he continued. "To become someone like you." I didn't know what to say. I'd spent so long trying to be invisible, trying not to take up space, trying not to be too much, that the idea of someone wanting to be like me felt foreign. But as I looked at Ramirez, I realized something. My story wasn't just mine anymore. In the weeks that followed, more young medics came to me with questions, with fears, with dreams they were afraid to say out loud. And I listened. Because once I had been to them. The girl who was told she was worthless. The girl who had to fight to believe she could be more. One afternoon, I was called into the office of Colonel Jacobs, the head of the medical training program. She was a woman who commanded respect with her quiet presence, her silver hair pulled back in a tight bun, her eyes sharp behind thin glasses. "Sergeant Carter," she began, gesturing for me to sit. "We've been reviewing your record." I swallowed, unsure of where this was going. "Your field work, your commendations, your work here at Walter Reed, it's exceptional." She paused, folding her hands. "There's a military medical conference in D.C. next month. They're looking for someone to speak on battlefield triage and combat medic training." My eyes widened. "Me?" "Yes," she said, a small smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "The commander himself recommended you." I left her office in a daze, the weight of what she had said sinking in with every step I took. The commander recommended me. Not just as a medic, but as a voice worth hearing. That night, I sat on the edge of my bunk, my dress uniform hanging nearby medals, catching the soft glow of the lamp. I traced my fingers over the badges, each one a memory, a story, a piece of who I had become. I thought about the little girl in Fallujah, about Alvarez, about the soldiers who called me Doc. I thought about the countless nights I had spent trying to prove I was worth something to a family who never saw me. And I realized I didn't need their recognition to know I mattered. Before the conference, I received an email from the event coordinator confirming my slot as a speaker. I sat there for a long time staring at the words, "We look forward to your insights, Sergeant Carter." That morning, I put on my uniform, adjusting the ribbons, the patches, the nameplate that read Carter. I looked in the mirror, taking in the reflection of the woman standing there. The woman who once stood in a room full of people who shared her blood, feeling invisible. The woman who once was called worthless. The woman who now stood unflinching in her truth. As I walked into the conference hall, the room filled with military personnel, medics, nurses, commanders, I felt the nerves rising in my chest. But then I remembered Ramirez and the other young medics who had come to me searching for guidance. This wasn't about me anymore, it was about them. When I took the stage, the lights bright, the microphone waiting, I paused, letting the silence settle. "My name is Sergeant Tessa Carter," I began, my voice clear. "And I am a combat medic." And as I spoke about the chaos of the battlefield, about holding a soldier's hand while pressing down on a wound, about the moments when fear and courage collide, I saw their faces. They were listening, they saw me. And I saw them. And for the first time, I felt free. Free from the need to prove my worth to those who could never see it. Free to live the purpose I had fought so hard to claim. This wasn't the end of my story. Because healing is not a destination. It is a choice made every day to keep standing, to keep living, to keep being exactly who you are meant to be. They say you remember the moments that split your life into before and after. It was a Tuesday morning when the email arrived. I was sitting in the small office at Walter Reed, reviewing training schedules and cross-checking supply lists, the mundane hum of duty that came between deployments and emergencies. The subject line made my breath catch: notification of award, Medal of Honor ceremony. For a moment, I just stared at the screen. The words blurred, the edges of the world softening as the weight of it sank in. I reached for my coffee, my hands suddenly trembling so much I had to set the cup down. They were awarding me the Medal of Honor. For my actions in Fallujah. For the day I ran into gunfire to save a child and her baby brother. For the day I disobeyed orders because I couldn't leave them behind. The day they once said made me reckless. The day I thought would ruin everything. Now they were calling it bravery. Colonel Jacobs knocked softly before stepping in, her sharp eyes softening as she took in my stunned expression. "You deserve this, Tessa," she said, using my first name for the first time since I had known her. "It's not about me," I whispered. "That's exactly why it's you," she replied. The days leading up to the ceremony passed in a blur. There were forms to sign, fittings for the dress uniform I would wear, briefings about protocol and media presence, all while I continued to train medics, still waking before dawn to lace up my boots, still showing new recruits how to wrap a tourniquet with steady hands. Because medals were given in moments, but purpose was lived in the everyday. The night before the ceremony, I lay awake on my bunk staring at the ceiling. I thought of the little girl's eyes wide with fear as she clung to me. I thought of the weight of her brother in my arms. I thought of the bullets cracking past the smoke, the heat, the pounding of my heart. I thought of how I had whispered to them, to myself, "Stay with me. And I thought of the girl who once sat on the porch steps in Ohio reading a library book about medics, dreaming of something bigger than the narrow world she was told to fit into. The girl who was called worthless. The girl who left without looking back. That girl had become this woman. This medic. This lifeline. The morning of the ceremony dawned clear, the sky a soft blue, the air crisp as I stepped into the uniform that carried every piece of my journey. Each ribbon, each patch, each medal earned not for glory, but for the lives they represented. I adjusted the nameplate that read Carter, smoothing it with a steady hand. Then I looked in the mirror. For a long moment, I just stood there taking in the reflection. And I whispered, "You are enough." The ceremony was held at the Pentagon, the hall filled with high-ranking officials, soldiers in their best uniforms, the weight of the moment pressing into every corner. I stood at the edge, waiting, my heart calm in a way I hadn't expected. When they called my name, I stepped forward, each footstep sure, steady. The commander stood there waiting. The same commander who once shook my hand at my brother's wedding, whose words had echoed through a room that never saw me. "She has saved more lives than any general I know." As I approached, our eyes met and he smiled. "Sergeant Carter," he said, his voice warm, genuine. "It's an honor." "Thank you, sir," I replied, my voice clear. As the medal was placed around my neck, the weight of it settled onto my shoulders, but it felt lighter than I expected. Because it wasn't just mine. It belonged to Alvarez, to the little girl in Fallujah, to every soldier who called me Doc, to every medic who would come after me. Flashbulbs popped the room, erupting in applause, but in that moment, I wasn't thinking about the cameras or the crowd. I was thinking about the promise I made to myself, to never let them define me. To never let worthless be the last word written on my life. After the ceremony, as people came to shake my hand, to thank me, to tell me how inspired they were, I felt the ache of all the moments that had led here. The nights alone. The days of doubt. The fear that I would never be enough. But I also felt the warmth of something stronger. Healing. When the hall began to clear, the commander found me again, his eyes kind. "Your story is going to change lives, Tessa," he said. "Don't be afraid to share it." I nodded, the truth of it settling in. Because I knew there were women out there sitting in their childhood bedrooms, clutching dreams they were told were too big. There were women who felt invisible in rooms full of people who shared their blood. There were women who needed to hear, "You are not worthless." That night, I stood outside under the stars, the metal cool against my chest, the night air soft around me. I thought of my mother, of the silence that would likely follow even this. And I was okay. Because I didn't need her to see me anymore. I saw myself. And that was enough. The girl who was called worthless was now the woman trusted to teach others how to save lives. The woman who stood with the commander, not because she needed his validation, but because she had earned her place there. And I knew this was just the beginning of what I could become. You don't need permission to be extraordinary. After the ceremony, after the flashes and the speeches and the medals, life returned to what it had always been: early mornings. Boots laced tight. The quiet hum of Walter Reed as the sun rose over the city, spilling gold across the polished floors. I walked the halls with my head high, the weight of the Medal of Honor both present and distant, a reminder not of glory, but of purpose. The young medics still gathered around me, their eyes bright, eager, afraid. They asked questions I once asked in silence. "Doc, how do you keep going? How do you stand the blood? How do you sleep after what you've seen?" I told them the truth. You don't always sleep, and sometimes the blood never really washes off. But you keep going because someone needs you. And because every time you save a life, you save a piece of yourself too. One afternoon, as I finished demonstrating how to tie a tourniquet blindfolded, a young woman named Harper approached me, her voice, soft eyes filled with the same fear I once carried. "Sergeant Carter, did you ever feel like you didn't belong?" I looked at her, seeing myself in the way she held herself small, in the way her voice trembled as if she was afraid to take up space. "Every single day," I answered honestly. Her eyes widened. But I continued, "You don't need permission to belong. You don't need permission to take up space. You don't need permission to be extraordinary." She swallowed hard, nodding, tears welling in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. That night, I sat at my small desk, the Medal of Honor resting beside me, the lamplight glinting off the engraved surface. I traced the edges with my fingers, remembering every moment that led here. The girl who left home without looking back. The girl who was called worthless. The medic who held Alvarez's hand while pressing down on a wound. The soldier who carried a child through smoke and bullets. The woman who stood beside the commander, not needing his validation but grateful for the moment the world finally saw her. And I realized none of it was about the medal. It was about the lives. The ones I saved, the ones I couldn't, the ones I still could. I opened my laptop and began drafting a program for new medics. A series of workshops not just on field medicine but on surviving the weight of carrying others' lives in your hands. On holding on to yourself in a world that asks you to give everything. On remembering that worth isn't something others decide for you. I called it "You Are Enough." Because that was the message I needed when I was 15, sitting on those porch steps in Ohio clutching a library book about medics, dreaming of a world I was told I didn't belong in. That was the message I needed when I was 18, signing enlistment papers on my birthday. When I was on the battlefield pressing down on wounds with shaking hands. When I stood in a kitchen trying to tell my family who I was and being silenced. And now it was the message I would give to every woman who felt too loud, too much, too big for the small spaces they were told to shrink into. You are enough. Weeks later, as I prepared for the first workshop, Harper stood in the back, her uniform crisp, her eyes steady. She raised her hand. "Sergeant Carter, why did you choose to become a medic?" I smiled. "Because I wanted to save people." I paused, letting the truth settle, and because in saving them, I found out I was worth saving too. When the session ended, Harper came to me, her eyes shining. "I'm going to deploy soon," she said softly. "I'm scared." I placed a hand on her shoulder. "Good," I said. "It means you care. Just remember, you don't have to stop being afraid to move. You just have to move anyway." She hugged me quick, tight, letting go before either of us could cry. That evening, I walked back to my quarters, the sun setting in streaks of pink and gold, the air cool and soft against my skin. I stood for a moment, breathing it in, feeling the quiet settle around me. My phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. I opened it. "Thank you, Sergeant Carter. I saw your video. I signed up for medic training today because of you." I smiled. I closed my eyes, lifting my face to the fading light. And I whispered, "Thank you." Not to anyone. To myself. To the girl who once believed she was worthless. To the woman who proved her wrong. Because in the end, it wasn't about the commander's words, though they mattered. It wasn't about the medals, though they meant something. It was about the choice I made again and again to stand, to keep moving. To save others. To save myself. Family called me worthless. Until the commander said I saved more lives than any general, but the truth is, I believed it before he ever said it.